Hello and welcome back to the Awaara Musaafir Show. Today's episode is really important because today we are talking about the world geopolitics. As we are all aware about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the world is constantly moving towards a multipolar power system now. In today's episode, I am talking with Mohamed Zeeshan, who is a policy analyst and editor-in-chief of Freedom Gazette, a policy advocacy site based in India. He is also the author of Flying Blind, the book on geopolitics and Indian foreign policies. He has previously served as consultant to the permanent mission of India to the United Nations in New York and advised government in the Middle East on issues of economic reform and state building. In this episode, we talk about a plethora of topics, such as was India right in abstaining from voting against Russia? We also talk about the history of Russia and Ukraine. We talk about why Putin is exactly invading Ukraine right now, and the reason behind that is not simple. It might be a very deep case. We also discuss how Russia is going to come out of all the sanctions that are being imposed on them by the West. The key element of this podcast is what is the role that India will be playing now, because in the next 5 years, the world is going to change a lot. The geopolitics, the foreign policies are going to change a lot. And what role India will play in this, we discuss today. So, hello, Mohamed Zeeshan ji. Welcome on the Awaara Musaafir Show. And today we are going to be covering a lot of geopolitics. We'll be talking about Flying Blind, the book which you have written. And so, before we start this podcast, let me just tell all our audience that if you are someone who is very new to geopolitics, who wants to understand India's foreign policy, Flying Blind is a good book to start with, because I was someone who was very new to geopolitics. I always had interest in it, but I wanted to go deeper. And Flying Blind, it started me towards that point. And then after that, I got to know, okay, this is what's happening. And you have covered a lot of aspects in this book. You have talked about China, US, and India's relations. In fact, the very first few lines you talk about India's role should be a very proactive role now in geopolitics. And that is a good point to start this podcast on, because as we all know, Ukraine-Russia conflict is going on. India has abstained, I think so, 3 times as of now. What do you think is this? Is this a right choice for India?
Yeah, thank you, Jayesh, for having me. And I'm glad that you enjoyed my book. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I meant to write this for people who are new to the subject. Of course, there is sort of this theoretical discussion and conceptual discussion that happens in places, which would be of interest to PhD scholars or whoever else. But my target audience was meant to be the general public and to try and get people interested in it, particularly Indians interested in it, because not enough Indians honestly speak about this. I can count them on my fingertips. So from that angle, I try to make it more accessible. Coming to your question, I can't say that I'm surprised. I don't think most people would say that they're surprised that India has abstained because, this is Russia, and Russia is a major world power. It's not Somalia or Mozambique or somebody that you can actually vote against and get away with it. But here, I think Russia and Putin in particular has made pretty clear that he's on a war path. And so anybody who kind of crosses him is on his hit list, so to speak.
Right.
So from that angle, I think that India was I think, always going to abstain. It seemed to my mind pretty predictable. But at the same time, it's unfortunate because, and this is something that I talk about in my book as well. The problem with fence sitting is that you are a threat to both sides of the people on both sides of the fence. Neither side can really trust you. Now, on the West side, for instance, clearly the US has always believed that India is a close ally, and the US wanted India to be a close ally. And India, likewise, after the Galwan clashes in 2020 with China, has also started moving towards the US. But now, having voted against, clearly the Western lobby, on a pretty clear-cut issue. I mean, it's a pretty black and white issue, which is very rare in international politics. This was a case of Russia not really being threatened in the immediate or medium term, but deciding unilaterally to attack and invade a country that was, quite frankly, much, much less armed than Russia was. I mean, Russian billionaires spend more on yachts every year than Ukraine spends on its defense. So this was a very lopsided contest. And so it was, in my opinion, a pretty black and white issue. But on the other side of this fence, you've got Russia, and India has abstained because India wanted to appease Russia, I guess is the argument they want to make. But what has happened as a result of the abstention is that immediately after the three abstentions, India put out, after each abstention, India put out a statement explaining its position and saying we stand for sovereignty and all of those other things, and we call for peace, etc. And if you compare what India has done with what China has done, for instance, China was very, very vocally in support of Russia. China abstained at the UN, but before the invasion happened, and even after that, China has kind of spoken against Western sanctions, and China has said that Russia has legitimate security concerns. So, in some sense, China has become a better ally to Russia than India has. Right. And so, Russia is looking at this and saying, okay, if there is a war between India and China, are we really going to help India against China? That's the question that the Russians are going to ask themselves. So India has ended up losing on both counts. So, at the end of the day, you've got to do in situations like these, especially, which are pretty clear cut and black and white, in my opinion, you've got to do what, is consistent with your principles. And clearly India's principles, I would like to assume, is against aggression, against violence, against foreign invasion. So that's where we should have stood.
Right. But then I'll talk about Ukraine, Russia in a bit. Before that, what the India's side, like India's perspective was after the abstention, that if China attacks tomorrow, would US come to the help? So this was their whole point. And do you think somewhere that this is a very gray sort of matter? This is not a black and white matter, because when you, like, as you said, that Russia is more a closer ally for China. And India, as of now, apart from Israel, there's no real ally for us.
I mean, the flip side of this question, so there are two ways to look at this. The flip side of this is to say that, okay, the US will not fight for India against China. I'm quite certain that if India and China go to war tomorrow, then the US is not going to deploy troops on the ground to fight for India in the Himalayas. I'm quite certain about that. But the other side of this is, what does India really gain by abstaining? India does not gain anything, as I explained earlier. And also, as you said, China is a closer ally to Russia. So Russia is not going to be fighting on India's behalf either. So either way, whether we are voting against Russia or abstaining, India is going to have to fight alone against China. The second angle to this is that this India-US relationship is a little bit of a chicken and egg story. India keeps saying, okay, only if US comes and fights for us, we are going to become a US ally. US keeps thinking, okay, let's wait for India to become our ally, and then, we'll take it forward to the next level. Now, if you look at any of the treaty allies, quote unquote treaty allies that the US has got, Japan or South Korea or NATO or whatever, these are countries that have kind of mutual defense treaties with the US. And so if a foreign country attacks them or invades them, then the US is treaty bound to come and fight for them. And the US has consistently said that it will do that. It's never been tested on that front yet, because I think also the other country is, Russia and China are kind of wary of pulling the US in. They don't want to fight against the US. So they broadly leave these countries alone. I mean, Russia has never invaded a NATO member, right? It's invaded Georgia, it's invaded Ukraine. The whole point of this, I think, to my mind, was that Putin wanted to go into Ukraine before Ukraine joined NATO. If Ukraine was ever going to join NATO. So I think in that sense, the US has got nuclear weapons stationed in the Korean Peninsula and all of that to, basically give protection umbrella to Japan and South Korea and others. So I think in that sense, you can look at it from that angle and say that if India actually becomes a treaty ally, so to speak, of the US, which also has its own costs, then if China attacks India, then the US is treaty bound to come to India's India's aid. But in order to get to that level, India needs to become more useful to the US.
Got it. And then, okay, so let me put it to you in this way, because when I look at a normal Indian today, they are more towards the side of Russia. They are more in support of Putin, because what they think is that Putin genuinely felt that he had some sort of issues with Ukraine joining NATO. He had some security issues. And then again, when we talk about US-Russia relations, we all know how it has been. And there was this one anti-ballistic missile crisis as well with US, where US has posted its like missile outposts, if I'm not wrong, which can intercept Russian missiles. So like, what is actually happening over there? How, like, what is the real reason behind Putin invading Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but I'll come to that. First I want to talk about why Indians are supporting Putin, which is a very interesting case in my mind. And I feel like there's a little bit over here of kind of supporting the underdog. They're looking at Russia versus the US.
Yeah.
And obviously the West is this, previous imperial power and history of colonialism and all of that.
Right.
Russia did not do any of that stuff. And the Soviet Union, which is not Russia, but, the Soviet Union was a close ally of India. So I think there is this underdog factor at play as well, which is winning Putin some sympathy. People are not looking at this as Russia versus Ukraine. They're looking at it as Russia versus the West, right?
Right.
So that's where I feel like Russia is kind of, Putin is kind of getting the quote unquote sympathy vote from especially India. But, in terms of Russia's actual security interests, first of all, I don't think that Ukraine was really ever going to join NATO. They've been talking about this for several years. But the reason that Ukraine never joined NATO is because NATO doesn't want to have a member in its alliance that has these kinds of disputed, contested border regions, and that's what Ukraine has, right? It's the Ukrainian border with Russia is contested. There are two breakaway regions there, Donetsk and Luhansk. Yeah. Crimea used to be a part of Ukraine, and now it's not. So that's also contested. So what happens is that when you bring in a member state into the NATO that has contested regions, it makes the likelihood of war higher. And so therefore NATO will be treaty bound to act in defense of Ukraine. And NATO kind of doesn't want to do that. And the US is, it's past its militaristic phase. I think what Putin is talking about in terms of, the US has got to invade or NATO is going to come in and all of that, I feel like that era has gone by. I mean, that was true, to some extent, the US in the 90s and 2000s was obviously militaristic. They went into Yugoslavia, they went into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. I mean, the US didn't go into Libya, but NATO did, and that was led by the French. So there was a phase, of course, years ago where the US and NATO were very militaristic. But the politics within the US has turned against that, right? And that's why, starting from Obama's time, people started to kind of pull away. Obama, Trump, and Biden, all of them agree that you've got to withdraw the, American militaristic ambition back in, because you had the Great Recession and all of these things. There are too many economic concerns at home. The US doesn't really want to be going in and fighting another costly war. Any president that starts a war is going to lose votes immediately. So I think that from that angle, certainly that concern is kind of outdated in my view. Now, why did Putin actually go into Ukraine? I mean, it's a matter of speculation. It's left to anybody's creativity and imagination, because, Russia sort of started to amass its military troops around the Ukrainian border, I think in October last year. And so it started out as a kind of they had an excuse. They said that we are going to do this military exercise with Belarus. But American intelligence said that these guys are planning to invade Ukraine. Yeah. But, there was never really anything in the public domain to talk about why they wanted to do it right now, because the concerns that Putin has put forward, these have been standing for the last 10, 15, 20 years. They're not new. He's been talking about it since 2000, at least 2007. He went to the Munich Security Conference and he talked about, pretty much the same things that he's talking about right now. So I think from that angle, it's not new. Why did he choose to do it right now? I have one radical theory, and the radical theory is that, he does not want, he believes that Ukraine is going to join NATO. I mean, it's hard to understand that he believes that, because for all the reasons I mentioned, Ukraine is unlikely to join NATO. But if he did believe that, then that means that there would be NATO troops close to the Russian border. But the only reason that would bother him very much is if his own popularity within Russia is falling. And it has been falling for the last many years, right? Putin has been in power for over 20 years now. And that is a very long time. Anybody gets, tired of a dictator that has been ruling for so long. People in the early 2000s used to be really happy in Russia with Putin because, like Hugo Chavez and China and all of these other countries, he was riding on this commodity boom. He was exporting a lot of oil and making a lot of money out of it. But after the Great Recession, a lot of the demand for commodities started to fall, and that impacted the Russian economy. So ever since then, I think Putin's popularity has kind of been slipping within Russia, and now you've got more vocal opposition voices coming up. You've got opposition politicians like Alexei Navalny, for instance, who have become more popular in recent years. Protests have become much more widespread and common in Russia. Right. In the last few years, including after this Ukraine invasion. Right. So I think that what Putin might have wanted to do was either he was hoping to win sympathy votes from within the Russian population by fighting a war, because in a war, everybody gets united, right? You feel that your country is under threat. That has not happened. But because he's fighting a one-sided war, nobody's fighting him back except the Ukrainians themselves. But the other thing here is that I feel that he was afraid of maybe suffering some kind of a revolution or a rebellion from Russians, within Russia. And in case there is a mass rebellion or revolution against Putin within Russia, then, having NATO troops close to the Russian border is not great news. Because that's what happened in Libya, right, to Gaddafi, and they're going to give military support and all of those things. That is not good news for Putin. So I think, and this is really out there, I could be completely wrong because, it's all speculative. But I think that it might be possible that he became more paranoid in recent times because he believes that, his own popularity within Russia is falling, and he wants to keep NATO as far away as possible, so that he can, keep himself in power, essentially.
Right. So, let me ask you this. In October, when this whole situation started, it started heating up really bad. Did you, at that point, even for slightest chance, guess that this would reach to a point where Russia would actually invade Ukraine?
No, I did not. I don't think anybody did. I remember tweeting at that point in time that, Putin is a very calculative, cautious kind of guy. He does not believe in mass invasions because, he's seen what happened to the US in Afghanistan. He sees what has happened to the US in Vietnam or in Iraq. I don't think that, at least at that point, I thought that Putin is kind of a much smarter guy. He's not going to go in and, occupy or try to occupy the entire country. Yeah. What I did predict, maybe not back in October, but, Jan perhaps, was I said that, maybe he's going to give military support to the two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. Which he later recognized as independent republics. I said that he might actually give them military support so that they are able to fight against the Ukrainian army and keep away. And then, over a period of time, maybe annex them and integrate them with Russia the way that he did with Crimea. So I thought there was going to be a kind of a limited military operation like that, because if he had gone in to do that, he would have won easily. Russia has a fair amount of support in those regions as compared to, Kiev or Western Ukraine. But instead, he decided to actually attack Western Ukraine from within Belarus and, go for the full Monty, so to speak. And he seems to be stuck there for the long haul. That was not something that I personally expected. I don't think anybody really thought that he was going to do something like that.
Right. Because one of the perspective that I heard was that after a point, he just snapped. When he genuinely thought that Ukraine is going to be a part of NATO now, he genuinely snapped and he took a decision in haste. And most probably it was a more of an emotional decision, because now when you look at the situation, there seems to be no end. Because who would have guessed that all the Ukrainians, the normal civilians, would take up arms? So what do you think is the end point of this whole conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to start with that he even thought that Ukraine was going to join NATO tomorrow. I mean, it's not a problem that has escalated in the recent months or years. It's been there for a while, right? And Ukraine has been saying since at least 2014 that it wants to join NATO. But but that was never going to happen. The Ukrainians kind of know it. NATO kind of knows it. The EU sort of knows it. Ukraine might have maybe stood a chance of joining the EU, but maybe not really even that as yet, because the EU kind of is struggling to keep its own membership, united at the moment with Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic and all these people kind of moving in their own direction. So I feel like even that was kind of not really going to happen in the short term. So what really triggered him is a big mystery. And as you said, I feel like it was an emotional decision, but what triggered that emotional decision to my mind is not yet clear. Yeah. But in terms of what he wants to achieve, I think what he wanted or thought he can do is kind of, chase Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, out and kind of push his government into exile and then put a puppet regime in Kiev. I think that was his end game. He's been talking about it as well publicly. He's been talking about wanting to have a pro-Russian government or whatever in Kiev. There was British intelligence that kind of identified a Ukrainian politician. I think that happened maybe last month.
Yeah.
Well, now we're in March, so maybe it was in Jan. But British intelligence said that there was this guy in Ukraine that Putin wants to install as the puppet president of Ukraine. I feel like that's where he was heading, and that's what he wanted to do. But I don't think he expected Zelensky, first of all, to stay in Ukraine and not flee. And I certainly don't think he expected the government and the civilians to stay on and fight as they have done. I mean, more than, I think, 1.5 million Ukrainians have already fled. They've gone into, Romania and Poland and all these other countries. But, the people who are still there in Ukraine, there's a fair bit of animosity against the Russian armed forces. And the more brutal this war gets, the more unpopular Putin is going to get in Russia, because there is a strong ethnic, kind of this familial bond between Russians and Ukrainians. So the Russians are starting to say, this guy is killing our own people, and they're not very happy about that. So I think in that sense, he's kind of, he's got more than he bargained for. And and at this point in time, he's kind of stuck. I don't see how he can pull out, unless he's going to, I think this is going to become another Afghanistan for Putin.
Yeah. In fact, I remember looking at this one tweet which UNHRC has tweeted out, which is by tonight, 1.5 million Ukrainians would be out of Ukraine. They are fleeing away. And what do you think went wrong from the side of, West and NATO? Because there was a point, if I remember correctly, Putin had himself mentioned that every nation has the right to join NATO, and someday even we might join NATO. But then what went wrong?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There was a time when Russia was being floated as a member of NATO, and there was a lot of collaboration between them. I believe that Russian soldiers even went and trained at the NATO academy until very recently. I think until Crimea. I think Crimea was kind of the turning point in my mind. Before that, I think even Obama's first term, Obama was kind of trying to pursue this reset in relations with Russia. Obama's presidency, you've got to remember, was all about trying to patch up relations with enemies, right? So he had the nuclear deal with Iran. He kind of found common ground with Cuba, with the mediation of the Pope. He kind of started to remove sanctions on Cuba. He was making this kind of outreach to all of America's traditional enemies around the world, because he believed that he did not, I don't think the US at that point in time, coming out of the recession, wanted to get entrenched in these things. Yeah. But I think that with the annexation of Crimea, which was triggered by a revolution in Ukraine against the sitting pro-Russian president at that point in time, Viktor Yanukovych, I think that sort of when the pro-Russian president kind of was sent off out of Kiev, Putin kind of figured that he had to do something to kind of hold on to Ukraine in some sense. And Crimea being located in the Black Sea, if you look at the map of the region, you'll find it's very strategically located. Holding on to Crimea gives Russia the opportunity to actually control access to the Ukrainian coastline. So that was a strategic decision that he took at that point in time. And when he annexed Crimea, I think that sort of really led down this path where there was no way to come back from there and say that NATO and Russia can have better relations again, because, NATO was never going to accept that annexation, and Putin was never going to give that up. He was never going to give Crimea back to Ukraine. And so in that sense, I think we got to this path where there was a deadlock, and there was never really a way to get past that crisis. And since then, Putin has become more and more paranoid over a period of time with his falling popularity, and now we are basically in a war.
Right. So, I was going to ask you this one question, which is, you mentioned that the situation might end up like what happened in Afghanistan. The same situation might end up in Ukraine. So, do you think what is happening in Syria, like the insurgency, is there a chance of insurgency in Ukraine now?
I mean, you're not going to have ISIS coming into Ukraine because, there is not an Islamist lobby within Ukraine, right? So there's nobody to kind of invite them in. I think when I say Afghanistan, I think what I mean is that you've got this perennial kind of low-scale conflict raging on for years between Russian troops and maybe militias built by the Ukrainians. You've got Ukrainian resistance forces here and there across the country. And so, they might, it's slightly different to Afghanistan in terms of geography and terrain. Afghanistan is very mountainous, so it's easy for guerrilla warfare to take place. Militias can hide in the caves and all of that. But in Ukraine, it's a bit more difficult because this is sort of part of the northern European plains. And so in that sense, it's harder for guerrilla warfare to succeed. But at the same time, I think, the question is how brutal is Putin willing to get? Is he willing to basically just carpet bomb the hell out of these people and kill millions of them altogether? Or is he going to be more measured, because that's going to create a lot of, protest back home? Is he going to be more measured and, say that we're going to push here, we're going to push there, but we're not going to push here? In this third place, we're going to compromise in this fourth place and go easy here, go hard there. That's sort of a military tactic. I think if you're going in down that path, then you're setting yourself up for a sort of a long-term occupation, because that's the only way that I can see him, sort of taking this to its logical conclusion. He's going to have to replace President Zelensky's government in Kiev with his own people. And so for that, he needs to chase Zelensky out of Ukraine, and how he's going to do that, I don't know. So it's, there's a lot of uncertainty here at the moment. A lot of it will depend on how brutal and inhuman Putin is willing to be. He's basically waded halfway down into the deep, dark sea. And so, now he has to kind of decide, does he want to call a truce and go back, or is he going to keep swimming with the sharks? That's sort of the situation that he is in right now.
Right. So this is one thing which, what will happen in Ukraine, that is one thing. And one thing is, how will Russia get out of this mess now? Because with all the sanctions that are coming in, and these are most probably the primary sanctions, the secondary sanctions might start coming in now, where the West lobby, they might sanction the countries which are dealing with Russia. So how do you think Russia will come out of this now?
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see what happens with the secondary sanctions, because one of the countries there is India, right? And so India is kind of this Western ally. You can say the West kind of needs or wants India's cooperation against China, but it's not clear at this point in time, to my mind, how they are going to cooperate against China, because India is not going to fight militarily for Taiwan and the US. And the US is not going to fight militarily for India against China and the Himalayas. So there's a lot of difference and gap between the two countries now. And so if the US kind of decides to put secondary sanctions, it can't give an exception to India. That's going to, in this situation, it's not like the Iranian nuclear issue where India is not a signatory to the NPT, and one can argue this side or that side. That sort of stuff can happen. But here it's not like that. This is a very, very black and white situation. It's happening on the boundaries of Europe. So there is a direct threat to Western Europe itself. There is a threat to NATO and the EU. So I think in that sense, it's going to be a lot harder for the US to give exemption to India if they do that.
Right.
But it'll be interesting to see what they do. Now, I think the other side of this is that, Russia and China are trying to kind of build this alternative financial system of their own now. So they're basically drawing down dependence on the US dollar so that they can escape some of these sanctions.
Right.
And sanctions are never going to get passed in the Security Council, right? Because Russia will veto them. So in that sense, it's not going to be like Iran or Syria or North Korea. Syria, Russia has vetoed, so it's more like Iran and North Korea. So it's not going to be like that. And, and so therefore, what we are now seeing is that China and Russia and Venezuela and Iran and all of these kinds of countries are coming together to say that we want to reduce dependence on the US economy. Right. And so let's build a financial system of our own. Let's start trading in our own currency so that we don't use the US dollar. China has started to buy actually gold in order to build up its foreign exchange reserves. It's selling dollars and buying gold so that, it has fewer dollars at hand. So this kind of a dynamic is now happening for the first time in maybe 30 years. And so it'll be interesting to see whether that succeeds. I think that's what Putin kind of wants right now. He wants to reduce dependence on Europe and on the West. And he also knows on the other side of it that the West kind of depends on Russia for its oil and gas, right? Especially Europe does. And so Europe has not yet found a perfect alternative to Russian oil and natural gas. They might eventually do that in a few years' time to come. We never know. But in the meantime, Russia still has some leverage over Europe, and I think that Putin kind of wants to use that as much as he can. India is kind of going to, I think, going to stay on the fence. It'll be interesting to see how far China is willing to support Russia. I think that's going to be the big factor.
Right. So do you think like the world is moving to I wouldn't say better, but a different system now, from maybe a bipolar system to a multipolar system now?
I mean, we had the unipolar system after the end of the Cold War, where the West was basically all supreme and, the US could do what it wanted. That sort of died out with Iraq, I think, because that's where the US kind of committed suicide. And then after, it never really got out of it.
Right.
But what I think we've now got is chaos. We've got anarchy happening at the moment. The sweeter term for that is multipolarity. But honestly speaking, it's chaos and anarchy because you've got a number of different countries and they're all putting national interest above, cooperation or collaboration or global interest. And so each one is now locked in a game of one-upmanship over the other. Russia and China is on the one hand, and then you've got the West. And then you've got countries like India, you've got countries like Brazil that are confused within themselves. The president wants to do one thing, the vice president wants to do something else. So they're voting at cross purposes at the moment. So you've got this chaos happening at the moment in global governance, and each one wants its own thing. And then, of course, you've got the Gulf powers that want to do their own thing. With Saudi Arabia and the UAE and so on. And then you've got these sort of slightly neutral but principled city-states like Singapore and others who have their own coalition actually at the UN. There's a coalition of small countries and small island states at the UN, and so they've got their own agenda. I think they call the Coalition for Good Governance or something like that, if I remember correctly. So you've got chaos basically, and none of these countries is really going to have its own way anymore. Even the West, for that matter. I think as I said, it's not as simple as the US putting sanctions on Russia and then saying, okay, we have punished Russia. It's not going to work that way anymore. Because you've got China, you've got India, you've got all of these other countries that can still do business or can still bail Russia out of trouble if they want. And so you're now heading into a state where there is vacuum and there is anarchy, and global interest is going to suffer basically.
Right. So, what do you think will be India's, a way out of this? Because this is a very tricky situation right now, and India almost every time finds itself in these situations where now it is a part of Quad as well, and it is a part of the Shanghai Cooperation as well. So, how do you think India is going to get out of this mess now? Because this was not India's war, and still India is there. India is stuck in the middle.
I mean, India is always going to be stuck in the middle. It happened in Libya. We lost a
Yeah.
few of our civilians there. It happened in Yemen. We had to go and evacuate,
Right.
so many hundreds of thousands of people because we've got Indians everywhere. We talk about it all the time. There are Indians all around the world.
Yeah.
Actually, statistically speaking, as I point out in my book, there are only 3 countries or city states where, there are no Indians or persons
Hmm.
of Indian origin. And one of them is Pakistan. So, which is
Right.
in some sense part of Akhand Bharat, you can say. So, that it's its own thing. So,
Right.
in that sense, India already is a country with global interests. We're going to get caught in the middle anywhere. And
Hmm.
so I think the lesson we should have learned a long time back is to, be more proactive and stay ahead of the curve basically and try and, shape things before they actually spiral out of control. But we've never really made the effort to do that as yet. I mean, are we going to succeed if we do that is another question. We might not.
Right.
We are not strong enough to do that. But the thing is that we are not going to lose anything by doing that. And that I think over a period of time, if you take a long-term strategic view, if India becomes more proactive, ahead of the curve,
Right.
then India starts to build its own influence and credibility, which is what I argue in my book as well, right? So I think from that angle, we've not learned our lesson. It doesn't seem like we're going to learn our
Yeah.
lesson anytime soon. But now the problem for India, I think, is very existential. I think India kind of needs to decide where it's going to align itself. Is India
Hmm.
going to there is no non-alignment anymore. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
It's not going to work because we have we have kind of ties to everywhere, and everybody is now at each other's throats.
Yeah.
And so at some point in time, you've got to start saying, okay, this is what is going to work for world peace, and so that is what we're going to support. And only when you start doing that will you build the kind of credibility and influence you need. If you don't do that and you continue to sit on the fence, then you are only making enemies out of everybody, because everybody
Right.
is now very distrustful of where you actually are going to stand. What are you going to do tomorrow? Even Russia is going to ask, is India going to become a US ally tomorrow because of a war with China? And if that happens, then will India start putting sanctions? All of these questions
Right.
are going to be asked in Moscow, right? Because India has not made its stand clear. And so, in that sense, I think that clarity is going to be important in foreign policy for India going forward.
Right.
But if you continue doing what you're doing right now, which is flying blind, then you're going to continue to get caught, and people are going to continue dying, and there is really nothing that you can do about it.
Right. But then, like I was reading this book by Dr. Jaishankar, the external affairs minister right now. And in his book, The India Way, he writes more or less, he has himself saying that India needs to take a proactive stand now. And as you said, India is not doing that. So what is the reason behind that?
Yeah, I mean, Prime Minister Modi also said this. I mean,
Yeah.
very early in his term, I think it was in 2014, I quoted him in my book. He said India needs to take a leading role and not a balancing role, right?
Yeah.
So
We need
these
to
guys
become
are
Vishwaguru.
saying things very similar to
Yeah.
what I'm saying, except that I've talked about what that leading role should look like. The
Hmm.
problem, I think, for India today is that India has not decided what this leading role, quote unquote, is going to look like, or what quote
Okay.
unquote Vishwaguru actually means. We are talking about it. We are throwing these words around, but we have not decided. And I'll give you an example. I mean, you've got to decide, for instance, are you a country that sees democracy as your interest, or do you not see democracy as your interest? I've given very realist strategic reasons for why democracy is in India's interest. But now
Hmm.
India itself is kind of going through a change of its own. So,
Yeah.
that evaluation is now again happening. So I think India is kind of not clear about what principles are in its interest, or what is in its interest, first of all,
Right.
whether Russian military ties are really in India's interest, or US military ties are really in India's interest. You can't have the cake and also eat it. So that's where I think India needs to start working immediately. We need to build some clarity on who we are. What is
Right,
India, right?
right.
And what does India mean to the world? And as an extension, what principles can India stand for? When Nehru was prime minister, he kind of had all of these things in place already, to be honest, because
Hmm.
India was coming out of its freedom struggle, and there were values and ideals and principles behind that. And Nehru, even before independence, had actually written and spoken extensively on various global issues, Spanish Civil War, and these other things.
Right.
And he had traveled to the Soviet Union. He had written about communism. He talked about it. He had written about what communism means for the world. How should the
Yeah.
world see? So Nehru, in that sense, had a lot of clarity when he became prime minister on how he sees the world, basically, and what his worldview was. But
Hmm.
since the end of Nehru's term, and really since the China War in 1962, India has not had any clarity about where what its interests are, and what it should stand for.
But like this might sound very blasphemous, but isn't that a problem of democracy then? Because when you have governments that might change after every 5 years, how can a government have set, norms and rules that this is where we want to reach?
Yeah, that's a fair point. But the problem is that no government has really said what it wants to stand for.
Yeah.
And so over a period of time, what has happened is that we have been kind of caught in between all of these sorts of dilemmas and not really found a way forward. Now,
Hmm.
Prime Minister Modi is in his second term with single party majority, right? This is more political capital than any prime minister has had since Rajiv Gandhi.
Yeah.
So I think it was an opportunity really for Modi to say, okay, this is how I see the world, and this is what we have to stand for. It's not going to be very radically different. If you look at the US, for instance, I think that Democrats and Republicans both agree that democracy is one of the American values, and they're
Yeah.
quite clear that human rights is one of American values. How they implement this might differ, right? I mean,
Right.
you might say, okay, we have to attack Iraq, we should not attack
Yeah.
Iraq.
Yeah.
That kind of debate is healthy, in my opinion. But
Hmm.
what India has not done is that India has not identified this fundamental, basic interest that India has to stand for. You can say, for instance, you can say that China is a threat. That can be an interest.
Right.
But we have not said that. It is not clear, really. I mean, the
Yeah.
army chief has said it some time back. The prime minister refuses to call China out for its transgression in LAC.
Right.
So there's a lot of confusion here also. Then when the Winter Olympics were held, India said, okay, we will not join diplomatic boycott. We are going to back China as
Right.
host of the Olympics. So there's a lot of
The trade is
confusion
still
there.
going on with them.
Yeah, that it kind of is still. And then after that, we changed our stand because the Galwan soldier was there
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
torch relay. So we're kind of stuck, I think, in this position where we have not really decided these fundamental basic things
Right.
that we can stand for, which say the US has done, or the EU has done. The EU is very clear that they will not provide aid to countries that are guilty of human rights violations. So if there is a genocide or something happening in the Congo or somewhere like that, they're not going to give aid to that
Right.
country. These things are actually written down as legal clauses in the EU's legal frameworks. So in that sense, I think that India has kind of not really decided what Vishwaguru really means and what we are going to teach the world.
Right. So, like, I have 1,000 of questions now, but I won't take much of your time. This is probably one of the podcasts where I just wanted to focus on Ukraine-Russia conflict and how and what role is India playing here. So, probably in future podcasts, I might ask you about the India-China issues, the internal conflicts in India right now. But to end this podcast, I want to ask like two questions from you.
Yeah.
One is, now that the world is completely changing, the system of the world is changing, what do you see like the next 10 years look like, and what will be India's role in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's 10 years a very, very long time in international
Right.
politics. I
Right.
mean, think back to 10 years ago, right? There was a Congress government in India.
Yeah.
Things were very different. There was scam and all those things were happening, but we had problems. We have different problems. We have other problems today. In the US, you had Obama running for a second term. This was 10 years ago. Nobody imagined that Donald Trump would one day become president and then pull out of the Paris climate deal and all of these guys. You didn't think that you would have a COVID denier in the White House or stuff like that, right? And what else was happening 10 years ago? So you had, I think 10 years is a long period of time, especially when you're stuck in this kind of flux where, everything is up in the air. You don't know what, where what is going to fall and how it's going to come out. But if I were to really venture out and say, stick my neck out and say what the world is going to look like, let's say 5 years from now. 5 years from now would be 2027, perhaps potentially post-Biden era. And you never know, Donald Trump might be back in the White House. It's hard to say. And, I see, for instance, that there is going to continue to be anarchy because the US continues to withdraw. And it's not powerful enough anymore to play the role that it used to play earlier. But on the other hand, China and Russia are not powerful enough to actually step up. I mean, China especially. I mean, Russia is nowhere in the picture, in my opinion. I think Russia is a declining global power. I think 5 years from now, we will be speaking less about Russia. Russia is going to be a nuisance state in Ukraine and all these, Eastern Europe and all of that. But I don't think Russia has the resources to go beyond that. I mean, even if you look at what Russia is doing in Africa, for instance, these days, Putin has sort of this private security firm, you can say, or mercenaries, you can say, which is what the Western media would call them. And instead of just giving arms and military and weapons to countries like Mali and others that are fighting against insurgent groups, Russia is actually outsourcing mercenaries as well. I mean, it's sending mercenaries to fight for these governments. But I think that is a sign that the Russian military or the Russian state does not have the resources that the Russian private sector kind of does. Or, Putin is kind of, obviously, these groups, these are private sector groups that are fighting there, but they've all got ties to the Kremlin and to the presidency. But they're all essentially, kind of crony capitalist private sector groups. So I think, and then with the sanctions and all of that happening, I think the Russian state capacity is going to be even more decreased. The US is now energy independent. I think the US is trying to make Europe less dependent on Russian energy, trying to find ways to, send LNG gas from the US to Europe and from Qatar to Europe and all of that. So they're trying to make, in that sense, Russia less powerful and have less leverage over them. So Russia, in that sense, is going to become even weaker. And then, of course, within Russia itself, it's hard to say whether Putin is going to last the next 5 years or not. I do see increased protest and opposition and unpopularity.
So you see maybe a next Russian revolution?
I mean, it's hard. It's possible. It's not impossible. I don't think. I think it's a question of how fearless the Russians are willing to be. And in recent times, they have shown that they are willing to be more and more fearless. More and more people are coming out on the street, right? So, in that sense, it's hard to say whether there's going to whether Putin is going to stay on or not. But either way, I think Russia's role in world affairs is going to become less. I think Russia is becoming a weaker country. China, on the other hand, is an interesting country to analyze. I think China is certainly on the upswing. Chinese power is certainly growing and expanding. But it's not clear to me whether, where the limit for this really lies. I don't think China can be as powerful as the US because China doesn't have the military presence of the US, so to speak. It has economic presence. But then that also has its own sort of downsides, because in many countries like Sri Lanka, for instance, people are not happy about Chinese loans, Chinese investment. They're talking about debt trap and all of these kinds of things. So there is opposition against Chinese power in a way that there was no opposition against American power in many parts of the world, 20 years ago. So China, again, is not really going to grow up to that level yet. So you're going to have this state of anarchy.
So there will be a power vacuum.
Yeah, there will be a power vacuum at the global level. And then, you're kind of going to probably see spheres of influence. So the West has its allies. China has its allies and client states. Myanmar is one of them. All the autocrats are one of them. Russia is going to become, I think, a Chinese client state. I think Russia, especially under Putin, is going to be more dependent on China going forward. If there's a revolution and Putin's out of office, then that's going to be a dark horse. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But for as long as Putin is in power, I think going forward, Russia is going to become weaker and weaker vis-a-vis China and more dependent on China. So China is going to have this big kind of network of client states. Now, where is India going to stand is a good question. In my book, I argue that India, as a secular liberal democracy, has a certain set of economic and political interests. And I explain what those are. And I say that they align more with the West because of whatever reason I've given. But, if India kind of decides in the next 5 or 10 years that it does not want to be a secular liberal democracy, it wants to be a Hindu Rashtra, there is going to be a lot more, whatever controversy with the West and, dogfights and disagreements with the West. You already had a lot of this, diplomatic wrangling between the foreign ministry, Indian foreign ministry, and the US. Every other day, there's a statement that comes out of some American politician, and then India responds saying that, this is, what's the word for that? Motivated attack, and, all of that kind of stuff. So India is, I think, in this existential quest, trying to figure out for itself what India really means and, who we are. And so if India is going to move, I think, away from the secular liberal, principle, then it's possible, to my mind, that allying or becoming a country closer to China is in India's interest in that instance. I think that a non-liberal or a non-secular India will not really need to fear China so much, in my opinion. Or rather, to put it the other way, China will not have to fear that India so much, or China will decide that India is not so much of a threat. Just as China has decided with other countries in its periphery, like Russia, for instance. China and Russia used to have their own disagreements for many years, especially during the Cold War and all of that. But today they are best buddies, right? Because the principles are a match. And so in many ways, Russia is not really much of a threat to China anymore. And so I think what's happening right now today is that China is looking at India and saying that if this is a democracy coming up in our neighborhood and then, becoming powerful and prosperous and influential and all of that, that is an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party, because more and more dissidents within China are going to start calling, for reform, especially under Xi Jinping. Because like Putin, Xi Jinping is going down that same path. In 10 years' time, you will start saying, okay, there are lots of protests in China and all of that. I think Xi is going down that path. And so in that sense, I think having a powerful India in the neighborhood is a threat, because then the Chinese dissidents can say, look, you kept saying that democracy is not good for us because, we can't become a powerful country. But look at India. It's a poor country, but still democracy, but still powerful, all of that kind of stuff. So I think in that sense, China believes that it's in its interest to kind of contain India's rise. Whereas, if India becomes like, say, I don't want to say Myanmar, but, Vietnam or whatever, sort of more trending towards the illiberal, less democratic end of the spectrum, then China is going to start looking at the rift between India and the West as an opportunity for itself. And so then in that case, I think you will start seeing better relations in some sense between India and China. And, given the power difference that you've got between China and India, in some sense, I think India is going to have to decide at that point in time whether it wants to have an antagonistic China or a friendly China in its neighborhood.
Right. So I have to ask this question now. I was going to end the podcast on the previous question, but this is very interesting. Like, I heard one of your podcasts where you were talking about that if in future West has to support democracy, the system of democracy, the example of democracy that would be of India. And in future, like the 5-year plan, if India moves and shifts towards the more sort of a right-wing democracy, do you think the West would support that?
That's a really good question. Actually, I did not make that statement. A Western commentator made that statement, and I was part of that panel. I remember that discussion well. And I was at that point, I thought that was an interesting remark to make, because really nobody, I think, to my mind, so far has made that remark. But I do think that the US is going to give India a long rope, in the sense that a lot of the violations or whatever that are happening in India will get overlooked. The US will continue to look at India as a democratic partner, so long as there are free and fair elections and all of those things. Maybe the US will look at India more like it looks at Turkey, for instance, if India becomes a right-wing democracy. Turkey, I think, is a good parallel for that. And Turkey is a NATO ally, right? It's a member of the NATO, and it wanted to be part of the EU, but the EU said no. Because of Erdogan and all of that. But I think the US still looks at Turkey as a potential partner in certain respects and in certain cases. For instance, in Libya, for instance, Turkey is looked at as a partner against Russia. And Turkey is looked at as a balancing force against Russia as well in many respects. So I think that the US will look at India more in that frame.
Got it.
Now, the problem is, I think the big question mark is that India is not Turkey, in the sense that Turkey does not have a large religious minority. I think when you look at India in that sense, you've got a situation where you've got a large minority. And so if you end up in a situation where there's a lot of resistance within India to a right-wing democracy, from liberal-minded Hindus who are pretty large in number, as well as from minorities of different kinds, then you are looking at a lot of unrest. Unless, you kind of decide, okay, right-wing democracy, not for us, we're going to go back to a liberal secular paradigm. And so that unrest is not going to allow the US to look at India the way the US looks at Turkey, because then you end up with an unstable state, right? And so an unstable India is not going to be as much, useful to the US as a stable India would be, whether it's a right-wing democracy or a secular democracy. And so in that kind of a situation, I think that the rift between India and the US will get much, much wider. Could potentially lead India to become more of a Chinese client state in that sense.
Got it. Right. So maybe 6th March 2027, we would be doing another podcast, a throwback podcast, and we'll talk about a lot of things that we have talked about today. But thank you so much for doing this podcast. There are many questions that I have now, but I'll ask those to you in future podcasts whenever we do those. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Jayesh. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Same here.